Have you ever watched a multi-million-dollar empire collapse just because of one deleted digital signature? The corporate suits I worked for thought they could outsource anyone to polish their financial reports, right up until they severed the company's main artery. My story is not about screaming matches or bitter tears. It is a financial death sentence executed in absolute silence. Grab a cup of coffee. This revenge is cold, brutal, and 100% legal. Hello to the wonderful audience of the Boss Revenge Stories channel. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero operating budget to keep bringing you these tales. If you find today's story compelling, please support us by joining our Patreon to hear exclusive true stories with multiple emotional voice actors that we cannot publish on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the comments section of this video. Now, let us begin today's story. And my name is Claire Ramos. I am 34 years old, a forensic accountant by trade, and until recently, I held the highly specialized title of Federal Tax Fiduciary Manager at Axiom Payroll Dynamics. Axiom was a sprawling behemoth of a corporation, a massive entity entirely dedicated to processing the payroll for some of the largest United States government contractors in the country. My workspace was intentionally devoid of glamour. I occupied a quiet, windowless corner on the fourth floor. Staying as far away as humanly possible from the forced cheerfulness of human resources and those incredibly hollow team-building exercises that usually involved catching tennis balls in paper cups or sharing fun facts about our weekends. I did not network. I did not mingle at the water cooler. But what the empty-headed executives playing golf on Friday afternoons completely failed to realize was that I essentially held the keys to their entire kingdom. Specifically, I held the federal fiduciary key. This was not just a password you could write on a sticky note. It was a strict biometric and cryptographic clearance tied directly to my personal license, a digital token that allowed Axiom to legally transfer tens of millions of dollars in payroll taxes every single month without triggering an immediate, agonizing audit from the Internal Revenue Service. The corporate ecosystem of Axiom was relatively stable and profitable until the unfortunate arrival of Julian Thorne. Julian was 38 years old and had just been appointed as the brand new Vice President of Global Optimization. He was exactly the type of corporate parasite you are picturing in your mind right now. He wore slim-fit suits that were tailored just a little too tight around the ankles, and he walked the halls with an overpriced iced matcha latte permanently fused to his left hand. Julian did not understand daily operations. He did not understand advanced finance, and he certainly did not understand federal law. What Julian understood was the dark art of spewing meaningless management buzzwords to justify his inflated salary. Every time he opened his mouth, it was an exhausting word salad of lean restructuring, synergistic AI integration, and agile offshore deployment. Julian was the kind of manager who genuinely believed that if an employee was not constantly and visibly presenting colorful PowerPoint slides in a glass conference room, they were simply dead weight holding the company back. It really did not take long for his predatory crosshairs to land directly on my department. In Julian's mind, a modern corporate machine only needed big-picture visionaries and automated software. When he looked at the company organizational chart and saw my annual salary, he did not see a highly specialized forensic expert shielding the entire corporation from federal prison. He just saw a glaring red cost number on a digital spreadsheet. He had absolutely zero comprehension of what a federal fiduciary actually was. To him, accounting was just basic data entry, a menial and repetitive task that could easily be outsourced to a server farm halfway across the world for a tiny fraction of the cost. He could not even begin to fathom why a single woman sitting quietly in a corner cubicle was being paid a premium salary just to click a button and approve tax transfers. The warning signs began subtly, but in the modern corporate world, subtlety is just a very loud alarm wrapped in a velvet blanket. First, my routine request to renew the budget for our specialized security software was denied with a cold, automated email citing new fiscal optimization protocols. Then, my mandatory quarterly compliance meetings with the executive board were abruptly canceled and replaced with brief, uninformative email summaries sent by Julian's administrative assistants. But the final, glaring red flag waving directly in my face was when I noticed a cheap, overseas third-party contractor team being granted low-level access to our peripheral data files. I watched the system logs as they poked around, testing the waters, trying desperately to figure out the basic mechanics of our complex payroll architecture. Julian was bringing in his agile offshore deployment to learn how to do my job. He honestly, truly thought a crash course in basic bookkeeping could seamlessly replace over a decade of forensic accounting experience and a federally mandated biometric clearance. A normal, well-adjusted person might have panicked at this point. A normal person would have marched straight into the Human Resources Department to file a grievance, or sent a string of frantic emails warning the senior executives about the catastrophic legal danger they were casually courting. I did not do a single one of those things. I am a forensic accountant. I do not deal in panic or emotional outbursts. I deal exclusively in ledgers, cold hard facts, and absolute inevitabilities. Instead of trying to save them from the consequences of their own staggering ignorance, I quietly began sorting through my digital drawers. I spent my days meticulously organizing my local files, ensuring that absolutely everything I did was perfectly documented, time-stamped, and strictly aligned with federal regulations. I backed up my personal digital licenses and slowly untangled any of my proprietary code from the company's main server framework. I knew exactly what was coming down the pipeline. Julian wanted a lean, heavily automated, globally optimized future. I decided I was going to step back and set up the most immaculate, perfectly lit stage for his stupidity to perform its final, magnificent act. The summons came on a Tuesday morning at exactly 10 o'clock. The calendar invite was deliberately vague, titled only with the phrase, "Alignment and Strategy Sync." But in the corporate world, a random mid-morning meeting with a vice president and a human resources representative only ever means one thing. I gathered my things, picked up my encrypted laptop, and walked out of my quiet corner toward the executive suite. They were waiting for me in a transparent glass conference room, the kind designed to make everyone outside feel excluded and everyone inside feel exposed. Julian Thorne was sitting at the head of the long oak table, leaning back in his ergonomic mesh chair with a posture that practically screamed arrogant entitlement. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, revealing a crisp white shirt, and he had his hands steeped together in front of his chin. To his left sat a junior human resources representative. She was a young woman in her 20s, and she looked absolutely terrified. Her face was pale, her eyes darted nervously away from mine, and she was gripping a manila folder so tightly her knuckles were turning white. She knew exactly what was about to happen, and unlike Julian, she possessed enough basic human empathy to feel sick about it. I took a seat opposite Julian, resting my hands comfortably on the cool glass of the table. I did not say a word. I simply waited for him to initiate the performance he had undoubtedly rehearsed in the mirror that morning. Julian offered a tight, predatory smile. "Claire, thank you for joining us on such short notice. We are going to keep this incredibly brief and focused. As you know, Axiom is moving toward a more agile, dynamically scaled future. We have been conducting a comprehensive review of our departmental redundancies, and unfortunately, your current role has been flagged for optimization." He paused, clearly waiting for me to gasp, or cry, or beg for my livelihood. When I did absolutely nothing, his smile faltered just a fraction of an inch before he powered through. "We have successfully deployed a new artificial intelligence suite," Julian continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "And we are partnering it with a highly motivated global support team of 5 dedicated specialists overseas. They are going to handle the tax data entry you have been managing. By transitioning your tasks to this automated and globally sourced model, we project an immediate cost reduction of 70% for your department. Therefore, effective immediately, your position is being terminated." He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, trying to look sympathetic, but failing miserably. Look, Claire, you have been great, but entering numbers into a tax portal is just not a specialized skill anymore. The machine can do it faster, and the global team can monitor it cheaper. It is just the evolution of the business. The human resources representative slid the manila folder across the table toward me. Her hands were physically trembling. Inside would be the standard severance package, a non-disclosure agreement, and a demand that I hand over my company badge. I looked at the folder, then looked up at Julian. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue about my value to the company. Instead, I reached into the deep pocket of my blazer and withdrew a heavy, black, metallic hardware storage device. I placed it gently onto the center of the glass table. The heavy clack of the metal hitting the glass echoed loudly in the quiet room. On the top of the device, catching the fluorescent overhead lights, was an undeniable, holographic tamper-proof seal from the United States Department of the Treasury. "Julian," I said, my voice perfectly level and calm, adopting the exact tone a patient kindergarten teacher uses to explain a very simple concept to a very slow toddler. "This is a federal fiduciary key. It is not a password. It is a cryptographic hardware token that is permanently bonded to my personal biometric data and my individual forensic accounting license. It is the only reason Axiom is legally permitted to execute mass tax transfers on behalf of defense contractors." Julian stared at the drive, his brow furrowing in irritation. He clearly had no idea what I was talking about. "Let me be absolutely clear," I continued, maintaining unwavering eye contact. "If I am terminated today, I am legally obligated to revoke my credential from the Axiom server infrastructure. The moment I walk out of that glass door, the payment gateway will automatically revert to an unauthenticated status. Your artificial intelligence cannot bypass it. Your 5 people overseas cannot override it. The system will lock." Julian let out a sharp, derisive laugh. He waved his hand in the air, dismissing my warning as the desperate, pathetic lie of an obsolete employee trying to cling to a paycheck. "Claire, please," Julian sneered, rolling his eyes dramatically. "Do not embarrass yourself by making up imaginary security protocols. I have overseen dozens of these transitions. The Information Technology Department has already mapped your server pathways. You do not hold any magic keys. It is just software, and we own the software. Now, I need you to sign the Transition of Authority Agreement in that folder so we can conclude this meeting." He tapped the manila folder impatiently. He was entirely convinced I was bluffing. His colossal ego simply could not process the reality that a quiet woman in a corner cubicle held more systemic power than a vice president of global optimization. "I understand," I replied softly. I opened his folder and smoothly pushed his generic exit paperwork to the side. Then, I reached into my blazer one last time and pulled out a single sheet of high-quality resume paper. I unfolded it and slid it directly in front of Julian. It was a formal internal memorandum, drafted with immaculate legal precision. "Since you are restructuring the department and integrating my responsibilities into your new automated framework," I said, offering him a sleek black pen, "I will need you to authorize this internal handover. It simply states that upon my departure, you, as the overseeing executive, are officially taking ownership of the system." Julian sighed heavily, thoroughly annoyed by the delay. He snatched the document and skimmed it for exactly 2 seconds. His eyes glossed over the critical sentence printed in bold ink halfway down the page. "Mr. Julian Thorne voluntarily assumes all legal liability for the federal tax payment portal from this moment forward." He did not read it. He just wanted to win. He wanted the satisfaction of conquering the meeting and kicking me out of the building, without a second thought. Julian uncapped the pen and scrawled his aggressive, looping signature across the bottom line. He shoved the paper back toward me. "There, you are relieved of duty. The global team has it from here. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal items." I carefully picked up the memorandum, verified his signature, and slid it into my leather portfolio. I picked up my Treasury-sealed hardware drive and dropped it back into my pocket. "Thank you, Julian," I said, a genuine, warm smile finally breaking across my face. I wish you the absolute best of luck with your artificial intelligence. I stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked out of the glass room, leaving him sitting there in his tailored suit, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just wrapped his own financial death sentence in a velvet ribbon and signed it in permanent ink. The weekend passed in a state of absolute blissful silence for me. I slept in, I drank good coffee, and I did not think about corporate infrastructure once. But for Axiom Payroll Dynamics, that weekend was merely the calm drawing back of the ocean before a catastrophic tsunami. Monday morning arrived like a runaway freight train. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the brand new global support team logged into the corporate mainframe, sitting in a brightly lit, low-cost server farm halfway across the world. These 5 individuals had absolutely no understanding of United States tax law. They only knew how to follow the colorful, simplified training manual Julian had provided. Their task for the morning was theoretically incredibly simple. They just needed to click a bright green button on their dashboards to execute a routine batch transfer of $40 million in payroll taxes for our top-tier defense contractor clients. The offshore lead worker clicked the button. The highly touted artificial intelligence suite woke up, stretching its digital legs, ready to process the massive lifeblood flow of corporate capital. The software scanned the outgoing data, rapidly searching for the required federal authentication token to validate the incredibly complex web of tax exemptions, classified military contractor codes, and international wire rules. The program reached the secure gateway. It knocked on the digital door, waiting for the biometric handshake. But I was not there to answer. The cryptographic bridge had vanished the moment I walked out of that glass conference room on Friday. Deprived of my fiduciary key, the artificial intelligence encountered an immediate, insurmountable logic paradox. It had $40 million sitting in a holding pattern, but it had absolutely zero legal authorization to move it. It could not verify the legitimacy of the funds. So, operating exactly as it was programmed to do when encountering an unverified, massive sum of money lacking federal clearance, the machine defaulted to its maximum security protocol. It slapped a giant, irrevocable digital red flag on the entire batch. The system forcefully categorized the entire $40 million under a terrifying federal classification code, suspicious transaction of unknown origin. If the system had just stopped there, it would have been a massive headache, but perhaps a fixable one. However, Julian had insisted on purchasing the premium software package, the one aggressively optimized for instantaneous compliance reporting. It functioned exactly as his glossy brochures had promised. It was violently fast. Within milliseconds of flagging the funds, the system automatically compiled a devastating, high-priority error report and fired it directly through the encrypted pipeline straight into the main portal of the Internal Revenue Service. Deep inside the fortified, heavily monitored servers of the federal government in Washington, digital sirens began screaming at deafening volumes. To the automated defense systems of the federal auditors, a contractor payroll company had just attempted to move $40 million unverified dollars out of nowhere, failed a security check, and dumped the money into a suspended state. To the federal government, this did not look like a software glitch. It looked exactly like the opening move of a massive, highly coordinated corporate money laundering operation. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy, invisible hand of the federal government slammed down hard on Axiom. Every single corporate bank account tied to the company was instantly locked by federal mandate. No funds could go out. No funds could come in. The financial heart of the empire stopped beating entirely. Up in the pristine executive suite, Julian Thorne was casually sipping his overpriced iced matcha latte when his computer monitor flashed. His inbox pinged with a severe, high-priority transaction rejection notice directly from the corporate banking partner. Panic, sharp and icy cold, must have finally pierced through his impenetrable arrogance. He stared at the screen, watching rows of red error codes cascading down his monitor. He tried to refresh the page. He tried to manually override the freeze. Nothing worked. But instead of sounding the alarm, instead of sprinting to the legal department to initiate a crisis response, Julian did what corporate parasites do best when they make a mistake. He buried it. When the chief executive officer walked past Julian's glass office a few minutes later and casually asked how the new automated rollout was proceeding, Julian did not hesitate. He plastered on a fake, intensely confident smile. "We are just experiencing a little bit of new software latency," Julian lied smoothly, not missing a beat. "The global team is actively monitoring the bandwidth as we speak. Everything is perfectly synergistic. We will have the minor lag ironed out by lunch." He genuinely, truly believed he could just call the information technology department, ask them to reset a routing server, and quietly fix a federal banking freeze without anyone noticing. He thought he was dealing with a jammed printer, not the United States Treasury. The pressure cooked inside the financial pipes all through Monday night. You cannot reboot your way out of a federal investigation, and hiding a $40 million blockage is like trying to hide an elephant under a living room rug. Eventually, the floorboards are going to snap. Then came Tuesday afternoon. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the digital time bomb detonated in spectacular, public fashion. It started with the phone lines. The customer service switchboards at Axiom lit up so fast and so intensely that the physical desk phones actually began to overheat. Thousands upon thousands of employees working for highly classified military contractors were going to the grocery store, trying to pay for gas, or checking their banking apps, only to find completely empty balances. Rent payments were bouncing. Mortgages were falling into arrears. Their hard-earned paychecks simply did not exist. Within an hour, the crisis escalated beyond customer service. Furious, screaming phone calls from 4-star military generals and top-level defense executives were ripping through Axiom's executive suite. These were not people who accepted apologies. They were demanding to know why their aerospace engineers and private security contractors were not being paid, threatening to pull hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts if the money was not wired in the next 10 minutes. While the executives were sprinting down the hallways, screaming at each other and scrambling to put out the massive public relations fire, the final, fatal blow landed. The heavy-duty fax machines and secure legal inboxes in the corporate compliance department simultaneously began churning out thick watermarked documents. It was an official, unappealable notice directly from the Internal Revenue Service, backed by the Department of Justice. The federal government was not just auditing Axiom payroll dynamics, they were executing a total, indefinite asset freeze across the entire corporate structure. The formal charges listed in bold black ink at the top of the document were enough to make any seasoned executive drop to their knees. The federal agency was officially investigating the company for gross negligence, corporate tax fraud, and large-scale international money laundering. The financial arteries were severed. The blood was draining out on the floor. The 70% cost savings Julian had promised to deliver was about to cost the company its very existence. I was not physically present in the building when the emergency executive board meeting was called to order, but the official legal transcripts and the frantic, real-time text messages I received from a former colleague in the compliance department painted a remarkably vivid and deeply hilarious picture of the chaos. The absolute facade of corporate professionalism, the carefully curated illusion of control that these executives projected every single day, completely evaporated the moment their own personal bank accounts and bonuses were threatened. The meeting took place in the grand mahogany-paneled boardroom on the top floor. The chief executive officer, a man usually known for his stoic demeanor and perfectly styled hair, was reportedly pacing back and forth across the expensive carpet, screaming at the top of his lungs. His face was the color of a ripe plum. He was slamming his fists on the table, demanding to know exactly how and why the Internal Revenue Service had managed to place a federal padlock on the entire operational cash flow of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. Julian Thorne, the architect of this magnificent disaster, was practically vibrating with terror. The arrogant, composed vice president of global optimization from last Friday was completely gone. He was sweating so profusely through his expensive, slim-fit suit jacket that large, dark patches had formed under his arms. When the chief executive officer directed his rage toward him, Julian immediately did what every cowardly middle manager does when backed into a corner. He pointed a trembling finger at the person who was not in the room to defend herself. He pointed at me. "It was Claire!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. It was a targeted sabotage. She was angry about the offshore transition. She must have planted a malicious virus in the mainframe right before she surrendered her security badge. It is a revenge tactic. She deliberately infected the payment gateway to trigger the federal alarms and hold our financial infrastructure hostage. It was a spectacular, desperate lie. It was the kind of lie a drowning man invents when he is grasping at thin air. Unfortunately for Julian, the chief legal officer was sitting directly across from him. She was a hardened, utterly ruthless corporate attorney who did not care about synergistic integration or artificial intelligence. She cared strictly about legal liability. The chief legal officer did not yell. She simply leaned into her microphone and delivered a bucket of freezing cold reality right over Julian's head. "We already had the cybersecurity forensics team tear the entire server architecture apart," she said, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. "There is no virus, Julian. There is no malicious code. There is no sabotage. Claire did not break a single thing. What she did was perfectly execute a federally mandated compliance procedure. She was terminated, and as a legally bound forensic accountant, she simply revoked her personal biometric authorization from our server. She followed the letter of the law to absolute perfection." Julian stammered, frantically waving his hands. "Well, then we just put it back. We just tell the global team to bypass her credentials and authorize the tax transfer." The chief legal officer looked at him as if he were a particularly slow insect, without saying another word. She pressed a button on her remote control. The massive projector screen at the end of the boardroom lowered from the ceiling and flickered to life. Projected in glowing, massive letters for the entire executive team to see, was the internal memorandum from last Friday. The room went deathly silent. Every single pair of eyes in the boardroom locked onto the screen, reading the perfectly highlighted sentence in the middle of the page, and then dropping down to gaze at the aggressive, looping signature at the bottom. Julian had legally, voluntarily, and officially assumed all personal liability for the federal tax payment portal. He had signed his own name to a document accepting responsibility for an unverified $40 million transfer that had just triggered a massive federal money laundering investigation. The entire board of directors suddenly realized that Julian had just painted a massive glowing target on his own back, neatly shielding the rest of the corporate officers from the immediate wrath of the United States Treasury. The color completely drained from Julian's face. He looked like he was going to be physically sick right there on the polished mahogany table. In a state of utter, blind desperation, his brain short-circuited, and he proposed the single most idiotic idea ever spoken in a corporate boardroom. "Listen to me," Julian pleaded, looking frantically toward the head of information technology. "We have her old files. We have her digital footprint. Just tell your software engineers to spoof her credentials, forge her digital signature, just for 48 hours, just long enough to unlock the system, appease the federal auditors, and push the military contractor payroll through. We can fix the paperwork later." The head of information technology, a quiet man who had worked at the company for 15 years, physically pushed his chair away from the table. He looked at Julian with a mixture of profound horror and absolute disgust. "Are you completely out of your mind?" the head of information technology asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. "You are asking my department to intentionally commit high-level federal fraud by forging the biometric identity of a licensed forensic accountant to bypass an active Internal Revenue Service asset freeze. That is a 20-year mandatory prison sentence in a federal penitentiary. I am not going to federal prison for 20 years because you wanted to save 70% on your quarterly budget. Absolutely not. We are not touching that system." That was the exact moment the final nail was driven into the coffin. The realization crashed over the executives like a physical weight. The company was completely paralyzed. They could not move the money. They could not fake the clearance. Their stock price was already plummeting on the open market as rumors of the unfulfilled military payrolls began to leak to the financial press. They were bleeding millions of dollars by the hour, and they had absolutely no internal mechanism to stop it. The chief executive officer buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, defeated groan. The arrogance was gone. The corporate buzzwords were useless. They had outsourced the only person who knew how to keep the ship afloat, and now they were all going down together. There was only one possible move left on the board, and every single person in that room knew exactly how humiliating it was going to be. They had to swallow their massive pride, pick up the phone, and beg the invisible gatekeeper to come back. It was exactly 3 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon when my personal cell phone began to vibrate on the kitchen counter. I was standing in my quiet, sunlit living room, holding a small brass watering can, leisurely tending to my collection of rare indoor orchids, the screen illuminated, displaying the private, direct office line of the Chief Executive Officer of Axiom Payroll Dynamics, a man who, just 1 week prior, did not even know my name or where my desk was located, was now calling me directly. I let it ring 3 times before calmly swiping the screen to accept the call. He did not bother with any professional pleasantries or forced corporate greetings. His voice was ragged, desperate, and entirely stripped of the polished authority he usually commanded. He sounded like a man standing on the edge of a very high cliff. He begged. He offered to immediately reinstate my employment with a guaranteed contract that would pay me exactly 10 times my previous annual salary. Furthermore, he promised to wire a massive 6-figure emergency consulting bonus directly into my personal account by the end of the hour. All I had to do, he pleaded, was get in my car, drive to the headquarters, plug my Treasury-sealed hardware drive into the mainframe, and authorize the pending batch of funds. I listened in absolute silence, pouring a gentle stream of water into the soil of a blooming white orchid. "I truly appreciate the incredibly generous offer," I replied softly, keeping my tone perfectly measured and completely devoid of any vindictiveness. "However, I must formally decline. I am afraid I have already signed a binding employment contract with a completely new organization. Accepting any financial compensation from Axiom or interacting with your payment infrastructure at this juncture would constitute a severe conflict of interest." He tried to speak again, his voice rising in panic, offering more money, offering stock options, but I simply wished him a pleasant afternoon and ended the call. Back at the corporate headquarters, the situation had rapidly devolved from a contained crisis into a brutal, highly visible public spectacle. With my polite refusal echoing through the speakerphone in the boardroom, the desperate executives realized they needed an immediate sacrificial lamb to appease the mounting panic of the board of directors. The corporate axe fell on Julian Thorne with terrifying speed. He was officially terminated without a single cent of severance pay. 2 large, unsmiling corporate security guards marched directly into his glass-walled office, ordered him to immediately step away from his computer, and escorted him out of the building. He was marched through the center of the main floor, right in front of hundreds of staring, whispering employees. He carried a small cardboard box containing a few personal items and his empty, overpriced iced matcha latte cup. His humiliation was absolute, and his reign of synergistic optimization was over. But firing the architect of the disaster did absolutely nothing to staunch the catastrophic financial bleeding of the company. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, a team of federal couriers wearing dark suits arrived at the Axiom lobby. They entirely bypassed the security desk and marched straight up to the executive suite, serving a stack of emergency, non-negotiable federal subpoenas. The Internal Revenue Service was no longer asking for a written explanation or a telephone conference. They were demanding immediate physical presence. The chief executive officer, the chief legal officer, and the newly unemployed Julian Thorne were legally compelled to board the next available flight to Washington, District of Columbia. They were ordered to appear for an immediate, closed-door oversight hearing with the Federal Inspector General of the Treasury. During the tense private flight to the nation's capital, The Axiom executive team fell back on their only remaining survival strategy, which was their own towering corporate hubris. Huddled around a polished mahogany table in the cabin of their private jet, they aggressively rehearsed their defensive narratives. They built an elaborate, fabricated storyline designed to shift the absolute entirety of the blame onto a catastrophic failure of the new artificial intelligence software and the incompetence of the overseas data entry team. They convinced themselves that this was just a standard, albeit severe, regulatory misunderstanding. Sitting in their leather seats, flying miles above the ground, they truly believed they could march into a federal building, deploy a small army of aggressive corporate lawyers, agree to pay a substantial multi-million-dollar civil penalty, and simply walk out with their lucrative business empire intact. They prepared their slick apologies and their legal loopholes, completely unaware that they were not walking into a standard corporate negotiation. They had absolutely no idea they were walking directly into a meticulously orchestrated execution. The federal building in Washington District of Columbia was designed to make you feel small, and it was currently doing an exceptional job of it on the Axiom delegation. They were seated at a long, incredibly heavy steel table inside a windowless hearing room deep within the Treasury Department. The air conditioning was blasting at full capacity, turning the room into an absolute icebox. Yet the chief executive officer, the chief legal officer, and Julian Thorne were sweating profusely. The heavy silence of the room was suffocating. They sat shoulder to shoulder, arranging and rearranging their useless legal defense files, desperately trying to project an aura of corporate resilience. They were fully prepared to face a panel of weary, gray-haired bureaucrats whom they could easily manipulate with complex legal jargon and the promise of a massive settlement check. At precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy oak door at the front of the room finally clicked open. The Axiom executives instinctively sat up straighter, their expensive lawyers adjusting their silk ties, completely ready to deploy their carefully rehearsed narrative about artificial intelligence glitches and offshore data entry errors. But it was not a panel of elderly bureaucrats that walked through the door. It was just one person. I stepped into the freezing room wearing a sharply tailored, dark navy blue suit that commanded absolute authority. My hair was pulled back, my posture was flawless, and resting heavily on my chest pocket, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, was a solid gold and silver federal agent badge. I was not there as a disgruntled former employee looking for an apology. I was there in my official capacity as the newly appointed lead federal forensic auditor for the United States Treasury Department. The sheer, unadulterated horror that washed over the faces of the Axiom executives was a breathtaking masterpiece of human emotion. Julian Thorne actually stopped breathing. His jaw dropped, his eyes widened to the point of bulging, and the remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. The chief executive officer gripped the edge of the steel table so hard his fingers physically shook. In that agonizing, frozen moment, the terrible realization finally crashed down upon them. The new organization I had mentioned on the phone yesterday was the federal government. The severe conflict of interest was the fact that I was now the chief investigator personally assigned to dismantle their entire empire. What they did not know, and what I had zero intention of explaining to them, was that the very hour Julian had handed me my termination papers, I had walked straight to my car, opened my encrypted laptop, and sent a highly classified 500-page forensic vulnerability report directly to the Federal Recruitment Office. I handed them Axiom on a silver platter, and they handed me a federal badge. I walked to the head of the table. I did not gloat. I did not remind Julian of his condescending remarks or his hollow management buzzwords. True power does not need to raise its voice. I simply unclasped my leather briefcase and dropped a massive, red-flagged federal dossier directly onto the center of the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," I stated, my voice echoing off the cold walls, perfectly even and utterly devoid of emotion. "We are bypassing the preliminary interview phase today, based on the irrefutable digital evidence obtained from your locked servers over the past 48 hours. the Department of the Treasury has already reached a final, non-negotiable administrative decision. I opened the heavy folder. The chief legal officer tried to speak, tried to interject with some desperate corporate defense strategy, but I simply raised my hand and silenced her instantly. Axiom Payroll Dynamics is hereby ordered to pay federal fines totaling $85 million for gross negligence and willful evasion of federal compliance protocols. I read directly from the official document. Furthermore, effective as of 12 o'clock noon today, your federal tax processing license has been permanently and irrevocably revoked. You are no longer legally permitted to process government capital. Finally, regarding the authorization of the unverified $40 million transfer, I paused, shifting my gaze directly onto Julian, whose soul appeared to have completely left his body. The personal liability waiver signed by Mr. Julian Thorne has been verified. His complete file has been formally transferred to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for immediate criminal prosecution regarding high-level financial fraud due to gross negligence. The empire was dead. With one single document, Axiom was completely wiped off the financial map. The chief executive officer stood up, his legs visibly trembling. The arrogant billionaire was reduced to a desperate, broken man. He actually reached his hands out across the table in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Claire, please," he begged, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. "There must be a remediation process. We will pay double the fine. We will restructure the entire board of directors. Please, you know this system. You know this company. Show us some clemency." I looked at him for a long, silent moment. I slowly closed the red folder, picked up my briefcase, and offered him a polite, chillingly cold smile. "You were exactly right last week," I said, my voice cutting through the freezing air like a freshly sharpened blade. "My job truly could be optimized, and I just optimized your entire company right out of the market." I turned my back on them and walked out of the room, letting the heavy oak door click shut behind me, leaving the men who had once considered me entirely invisible to drown in the magnificent wreckage they had built with their own two hands. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let me know down in the comments section. If you enjoyed today's corporate takedown, please consider supporting the channel by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon. It is the only place where you can listen to our very best, most exclusive true stories that are simply too intense to publish publicly on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the Patreon QR code currently on your screen, or by using the direct link located in the video description or the pinned comment below. Thank you again, and stay sharp out there.